Hi everyone, this is Dr. Shaima and this session is on hypothalamus, all the details of hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is basically that region of the brain which is composed of many small nuclei with diverse functions. That is what the first point tells. I want you all to remember that hypothalamus is that area in the brain which is composed of various nuclear groups which are doing diverse functions, different functions they do. And it is located above the midbrain, below the thalamus, and the hypothalamus makes up the ventral diencephalon. So, you need to keep in mind the location. It is located above the midbrain, below the thalamus. Look at this figure. You can see the hypothalamus is here, below the thalamus, above the midbrain, and it makes up the ventral diencephalon. So, ventral diencephalon is made up by the hypothalamus, is situated above the midbrain, below the thalamus. And the diencephalon includes not only the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus, thalamus and the subthalamus. See, this point I have told you, this is point number 1, this is 2, where you need to mention the location of hypothalamus. It is located above the midbrain and below the thalamus. Third point, we need to mention that hypothalamus makes up the ventral diencephalon. And the fourth point is the diencephalon includes hypothalamus, thalamus and the subthalamus. This is that initial, the few things which you are going to write as introduction when you write about hypothalamus. Now, look at this diagram where it is a mid-sagittal section through the brain which is showing the most important components in the brain. In that, can you see the hypothalamus? Hypothalamus is there. Hypothalamus, 1, that's here. Then can you see the subthalamus here? Thalamus is here. Subthalamus. These three components, that is hypothalamus, thalamus and the subthalamus, makes up the diencephalon of the brain. You can see all the other related structures also. Spinal cord is here, cerebellum here, the brain stem structures are there, the pituitary gland, all that you can see, the cerebral cortex on top. So, hypothalamus, thalamus and the subthalamus together makes up the diencephalon. Now, little more interesting things about the hypothalamus. In adult human, if you look at the hypothalamus, which is the master gland in your body controlling so many functions of your body, look at the size. It is just the size of an almond. Just the size of an almond, hardly this much, is going to be the size of the hypothalamus, which is basically a collection of nuclei which is doing diverse functions. That's number 1. It serves as a major headquarters for coordinating many functions in the body. It's responsible for coordinating autonomic reflexes of the brainstem and also the spinal cord. So, both the autonomic reflexes of the brainstem and the spinal cord is being coordinated at this almond's sized structure, which is hypothalamus, which is a collection of nuclei which is doing all diverse functions. And it's a major headquarters for coordinating many functions in your body. And look at the last one. It activates the somatic motor system, endocrine system when responding to signals generated either within the hypothalamus or brainstem or in the higher centers such as the limbic system. Read through that last point once again. It will activate the endocrine system and somatic motor system. So, when is it ending up activating the endocrine system and the somatic motor system? That is the response of the hypothalamus to the impulse which is receiving within the hypothalamus or the brainstem or any other higher centers such as the limbic system. The response to all these structures is going to be an endocrine response or a somatic motor system response, which is going to be mediated by the hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus, if you see, it synthesizes, not only synthesizes, it secretes different neurohormones. And the second important point I want you all to remember is it acts as a conduit between the nervous system and the endocrine system via the pituitary gland or the hypophysis. What do you mean by a conduit? Conduit is something like a channel. So, first one is it synthesizes and secretes different neurohormones. Second one is it is acting as a conduit or a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and it is acting as a conduit via the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. Look at the third function. It regulates the hemo or the homeostatic functions, such as it's not hemostatic. Hemostasis means it is something related to blood. So, here it is homeostasis. So, it regulates all the homeostatic functions. What are the homeostatic functions which are referring here? Like hunger, thirst, body temperature, all the circadian rhythms. So, this is the functions of hypothalamus in kind of an overview. So, the detail one by one we will be going. So, here we talk about hypothalamus secretes and synthesizes and secretes different neurohormones. It acts as a conduit between the endocrine system and the nervous system through the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. It regulates different homeostatic functions like hunger, thirst, body temperature, circadian rhythms, all that is regulated by the hypothalamus. So, this picture basically you can see the hypothalamus is drawn big, where you can see all these nucleus, the posterior hypothalamic nuclei, the dorsal nuclei, the anterior hypothalamic, all these, you know, hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei where each nuclei is doing different functions. So, this is going to be the hypothalamus. You can see the pituitary gland here, and hypothalamus acts as a conduit between the endocrine system and the nervous system through the pituitary gland or the hypophysis. Now, let us go to the connections of hypothalamus. So, connections of hypothalamus, you will have to know the efferent connections and the efferent connections of hypothalamus. Efferent connections means from where and all hypothalamus is receiving its inputs, and under efferent connections, you will be seeing to where and all hypothalamus is giving connections. So, coming to efferent connections, hypothalamus receives impulse or stimulus from limbic lobe. From limbic lobe, hypothalamus is receiving connection, and that is via the median forebrain bundle. Hypothalamus receives inputs from hippocampus. Now, from hippocampus, hypothalamus is receiving via the fornix to the mammillary body. Hypothalamus receives inputs from thalamus, reticular formation, globus pallidus, prefrontal area, premotor area, autonomic efferents, and also the retina. So, from all these areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, from all these 8 structures or areas, hypothalamus is receiving input from. So, let us go once again: limbic lobe, hippocampus, thalamus, globus pallidus, reticular formation, prefrontal area and premotor area, autonomic efferents, and retina. So, totally from 8 areas, hypothalamus receives its efferents. Now, once hypothalamus receives inputs from all these areas, it is going to process it accordingly. It is going to send efferent connections to all these structures, that is limbic lobe, thalamus and prefrontal lobe. It goes to thalamus via the mammillothalamic tract, reticular formation, all the tracts which are controlling the autonomic activity, and fifth one, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So, it is through these efferents and these efferent structures or connections, hypothalamus is exerting its control to different, the control systems of the body. So, efferent connections, efferent fibers it is sending to limbic lobe, thalamus. So, most of it, if you look here, from wherever it has received its efferent fibers, it is sending back efferent fibers too, isn't it? Limbic lobe, thalamus and prefrontal lobe, thalamus separately via the mammillothalamic tract, reticular formation, all the tracts which are controlling the autonomic activity, and also the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So, that is about the efferent and the efferent connections of hypothalamus. Now, going to the functions of hypothalamus. So, this is just one by one, all these functions we are going to go in detail. So, these are the How many? Totally 10 functions of hypothalamus. The control of autonomic nervous system. It's a center for the regulation of body temperature. It's involved in the regulation of water balance, neurosecretory function, control of sexual functions, control of appetite, hunger and feeding, emotional behavior and also emotional exteriorization, its influence on sleep, the relation to stress and biological rhythm. So, these are all the functions of hypothalamus. Now, each one by one we are going to in detail. So, first let us go to the control of autonomic nervous system. Now, here there is something which you need to know called as the Sherrington head ganglion. Sherrington was the name of the scientist who have done an extensive work on all this. So, that ganglion is basically the collection of cell bodies, and this Sherrington head ganglion, the posterior and the lateral nuclei, after all these experiments, it's been concluded that it is the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus, that is posterior nuclei and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus is the sympathetic center. So, how did they conclude that probably this posterior nuclei of the hypothalamus and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus should be the center of sympathetic nervous system? The conclusion was whenever the Sherrington head ganglion or the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the thalamus is being stimulated, all these responses were there. And all these responses, if you see, are very characteristic. See, cardiac acceleration, that means cardiac activity to increase, vasoconstriction, rise in blood pressure, pupillary dilation, adrenaline release, piloerection, inhibition of GI movements and also the bladder movements. All these are very characteristic to an increased sympathetic activity, isn't it? So, when the stimulation of the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus produced all these responses, that resulted in the conclusion that probably the posterior and the lateral nuclei of the hypothalamus is the sympathetic center. So, that is about, the hypothalamus controls the autonomic activity of the body because the sympathetic nervous system center is present in the hypothalamus where the posterior and the lateral nuclei. Now, if you look at the body temperature regulation. Now, coming to the body temperature regulation, the center for heat loss and the center for heat gain, both this is present in the hypothalamus. Now, what is the center for heat loss? It is the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and the center for heat gain is the posterior nuclei. So, whenever the anterior nucleus of the hypothalamus was stimulated, there was vasodilation, there was sweating. Whenever the posterior nuclei of the hypothalamus was stimulated, there was vasoconstriction and there was shivering, which made the scientists conclude that the center for heat loss is the anterior nuclei of hypothalamus and the center for heat gain is the posterior nuclei. And when the hypothalamus was removed in experimental setup, the animal was poikilothermic. That means when the hypothalamus was removed, the animal could not maintain a normal body temperature. So, which states that both the center for heat loss and heat gain is at the hypothalamus. Now, coming to the third function, which is water balance. Now, what is the involvement of hypothalamus in regulating your water levels in the body in different compartments? That is, the water which is present inside your vessel, in the extracellular fluid compartment, in the intracellular fluid compartment. How is the water balance maintained? Look at the first point. Hypothalamus secretes a hormone ADH, that is anti-diuretic hormone, and this anti-diuretic hormone will go and act at the last part of the nephron, that is a collecting duct. ADH can act, and ADH acts. What happens is, at the collecting duct, water can be reabsorbed only in the presence of ADH. So, that's why the first point tells hypothalamus secretes ADH, which reabsorbs water from the kidney. So, what happens then? The osmoreceptors are present. Where are the osmoreceptors present? That is the supraoptic nuclei. Now, this supraoptic nuclei, any ECF osmolarity, any change or alteration in the ECF, extracellular fluid osmolarity, will be sensed by the supraoptic nuclei. That means whenever there is any water loss, any water deprivation, any dehydration, what happens to osmolarity? The osmolarity increases. Osmolarity increases whenever there is any form of dehydration. What happens then? When osmolarity is increased, immediately what happens? ADH will be released by the hypothalamus. So, osmolarity increases when there is dehydration. So, the need for the body for more water has increased now. That's the reason why hypothalamus senses it, releases more of ADH. Now, what does ADH do? ADH increases the water reabsorption at the kidney, that is from the collecting tubules, isn't it? Along with that, what is happening? It is activating the thirst center. So, whatever water in the body is trying to maximum reabsorb, secrete a maximum concentrated urine. That is the first thing where it is, sense the stimulus was an increase in osmolarity. Second thing is hypothalamus has got the thirst center. So, thirst center is getting stimulated. Now, the center or the thirst center is a lateral hypothalamus. So, moment the thirst center, the lateral hypothalamus gets stimulated, the person starts drinking more and more water. So, all these are ways by the body will be able to overcome this dehydration. And what happens? The stimulated by intracellular dehydration, that is the stimulation of lateral hypothalamus. Lateral hypothalamus, which which is the center of thirst, gets stimulated when there is an intracellular dehydration. When ADH is released, when the osmolarity increases. So, osmolarity increases, ADH secretion is increased when there is intracellular dehydration. The lateral hypothalamus, which has the thirst center, gets stimulated, more water is retained, thirst center stimulated, the person consumes more water. So, what happens is the body comes over that state of dehydration, and that's how the water balance is maintained in the body. So, that's with the third function. Now, the fourth function is the neurosecretory function. Now, what is a neurosecretory function? You know that hypothalamus acts as a conduit, isn't it? Conduit between what? Between the neural and the endocrine thing, which is through the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. So, hypothalamus, if you see, it synthesizes and secretes a lot of hormones actually, and the posterior pituitary hormones, if you see, they are ADH and oxytocin. Neurosecretory cells, which are present in the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nuclei, it will travel via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal fibers and it gets stored in the posterior pituitary. So, basically hypothalamus itself has a capacity to synthesize a lot of hormones, and these hormones, if you see, they get stored in the posterior pituitary. So, posterior pituitary hormones like ADH and oxytocin, the neurosecretory cells which are present in the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei, it will travel via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal fibers and it gets stored in the posterior pituitary. Now, hypothalamus, you have to talk about the releasing and the inhibiting hormones. Now, this releasing and the inhibiting hormones, if you see, they are secreted by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. Now, exactly which part of the hypothalamus? The median eminence of the hypothalamus is from where the releasing and the inhibiting hormones are being release. So, what will happen? This releasing and the inhibiting hormones, they are also reaching the pituitary via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal circulation, and here the releasing and the inhibiting hormones are getting stored in the anterior pituitary. And this releasing and the inhibiting hormones, if you see, they it is actually secreted by the median eminence and it is getting stored in the anterior pituitary. And from the median eminence, how is it reaching the anterior pituitary? It is travelling via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Now, this neurosecretory function, again to continue, it is this neuroendocrine regulatory mechanism which is operating in the body, where the See, you know that both the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, both the neurosecretory, releasing, inhibiting hormones, all that once released by the hypothalamus is getting stored there. So, when exactly is the amount or the level of secretion is going to be increased, when is it going to be decreased? For all that, there is a regulatory mechanism which is operating in the body, which you call as the neuroendocrine regulatory mechanism. And what does this regulatory mechanism do? Which is actually the secretions are adjusted to the needs of the changing internal and the external environment. That means it will vary depending on when the need to increase a particular parameter is there in the body. Accordingly, that particular hormone's secretion is going to be increased. So, that is what the second point is telling. The secretion is adjusted, whether it's going to be more of a secretion or a reduced secretion is going to be determined by the environmental factors. Now, the neuroendocrine hormones are, you have the growth hormone releasing and the inhibiting hormone, then you have the corticotropin releasing hormone, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the luteinizing hormone releasing hormone, the prolactin releasing and inhibiting hormone. These many releasing and inhibiting hormones are there, all these are there, and this, whether they are going to be secreted in more amount, whether they are going to be secreted in less amount, all that is going to be adjusted to the needs of the challenges from your internal and external environment. So, that is about the neurosecretory functions of hypothalamus. Now, coming to how is hypothalamus involved in the sexual functions of a being. So, now the sexual functions hypothalamus does or carries out via the GnRH. What is this GnRH? The gonadotropin releasing hormone hypothalamus influences. So, it is why the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the sexual functions are being controlled by the hypothalamus. Now, what sexual functions are we referring to here? The onset of puberty, gametogenesis, the ovulation which needs to happen on the 14th day of a menstrual cycle in females, the regulation and the secretion of the gonadal hormone. So, along with the limbic lobe, if you see, hypothalamus is also coordinating the sexual behavior of the person. Now, whenever the hypothalamus is stimulated, there is increase in the sex drive, and whenever there is a lesion of the hypothalamus, if you see, and all these experiments, both this stimulation of hypothalamus, a lesion of the hypothalamus, where it was observed in experimental setup that the sexual drive of the monkeys was increased and also reduced, which confirmed that hypothalamus along with limbic system controls the different sexual behavior of an individual, and it's via the gonadotropin releasing hormone. All these four aspects of the sexual behavior or the sexual function is being regulated by the hypothalamus. Now, how is hypothalamus controlling hunger, appetite and feeding? Now, this experiment which made us reach this conclusion on hunger, appetite and feeding, what is the role of hypothalamus, was done by the Indian scientist B.K. Anand and Brobeck in the year 1951. Now, after their experiments, doing a lot of extensive experimental work, the conclusions were the feeding center is the lateral hypothalamus. When the lateral hypothalamus is stimulated, the person eats. So, that is why the lateral hypothalamus is the feeding center. The ventromedial hypothalamus is the satiety center. That means for you to feel full, for you to stop eating, the stimulus or the center is a ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now, whenever this lateral hypothalamus is stimulated more, what will happen? More stimulation of the lateral hypothalamus, there is excessive feeding. The person or the animal tends to eat more and more. And whenever there is stimulation of the ventromedial nucleus, more stimulated, what will happen? Or stimulated, the person or the animal stops eating. Now, whenever the feeding center, that is the lateral hypothalamus, is destroyed, then the person cannot eat. Whenever there is destruction of cannot eat, you better use the word anorexia. Anorexia is, that is, the person is not able to eat. That is experimental condition. How anorexia was developed was when the feeding center was destroyed. Now, when the destruction of the satiety center, that is the ventromedial nucleus, when it is distracted or when it is destroyed, what happens is the animal goes into voracious appetite. That means he is not able to stop eating. He continuously eats. There is voracious appetite which leads to a particular obesity which we call as the hypothalamic obesity. So that's about, or that's a conclusion, or that is how we confirm or reconfirm that hypothalamus is the center which is controlling hunger, appetite, and also an animal's or a being's feeding habits. Now, there are two centers which regulate food intake and also the body weight. So, after food intake, so basically regarding this control of hypothalamus or the involvement of hypothalamus in hunger, appetite, and feeding, there are different theories which are ruling it. So, those theories are like, the glucostatic theory, the aminostatic theory, the lipostatic theory, and also the thermostatic theory. That means all these theories in part is actually explaining a person's or an animal's feeding or the eating behavior. So, look at the points which I mentioned here. There are two things. First thing you want to remember, there are two centers which are regulating food intake and a person's body weight. Number two is, after food intake, the feeding center activity is inhibited by the satiety center. That means after the person has taken in food, enough and food is gone. So, what happens is the feeding center's activity, which is the feeding center, what did I tell you? The lateral hypothalamus is the feeding center and the ventromedial nucleus is the satiety center. So, after food intake has happened, the feeding center's activity will inhibit the satiety center's activity. So, the regulatory mechanism, what regulates it is those four theories I have told you, the glucostatic theory, the aminostatic theory, the lipostatic theory, and finally the fourth one, the thermostatic theory. So, one by one you need to know. It's very simple actually. Glucostatic theory. So, glucostatic means something to do with glucose, isn't it? So, what this theory tells us, according to this theory, an increase, first, let's just read the definition and then I'll explain you what it is. So, according to this theory, an increase in the blood glucose concentration results in increased feeling of satiety, whereas a drop in the blood glucose concentration has the opposite effect. Look at the second point, increased glucose utilization, feeding center is inhibited and satiety center is activated. So, what happens here is glucostatic theory, as the person is chewing, eating food, he is eating. Food is, so as you're chewing the food itself, the digestion has started, isn't it? So, what happens? The glucose, the final carbohydrate digestion product, the carbohydrate digestion which is happening in the mouth itself, glucose level starts increasing in the body. So, basically this glucose level, now this level of glucose is going to be the stimulus for the satiety level. So, as the glucose level keeps on increasing, satiety center is getting sensed, and when the glucose level reaches a particular level, the satiety center starts working, it gets stimulated and you get that feeling of fullness. So, that is exactly the reason. What happens is when you are a fast eater, you literally don't chew your food, you gobble your food. What happens is before the satiety center has sensed it, before your glucose levels have increased, which has made the satiety center sense that or wants to tell your body to stop eating, you would have overeaten. That's the reason why it's told that you have to eat slowly. So, fast eating, normally this process gets disturbed. Now, coming to the aminostatic theory. So, earlier glucostatic theory, it was the increase in the glucose level which was stimulating the satiety center, which would ask your body to stop eating, isn't it? But here it is something to do with amino acids. So, as a person is having food, slowly you eat, the digestion has started, amino acids are there in the blood now. Now, this amino acids in the blood have a similar effect. Now, food which is present in the GI tract is actually releasing polypeptides, isn't it? And these polypeptides are acting on the hypothalamus. So, when the polypeptides are acting on the hypothalamus, it is inhibiting the food intake. The satiety center is getting stimulated. How is it happening? When the polypeptides are acting on the hypothalamus, which are all digested byproducts, isn't it? So, what happens there is CCK, cholecystokinin, then GRP, glucagon, somatostatin, all this would inhibit the food intake. So food in the GI tract would actually release polypeptides, isn't it? Digestion is happening. As you have started chewing, digestion has happened. So this polypeptides which are there now, it is actually going and stimulating the hypothalamus. And what is the response of hypothalamus to the stimulation of polypeptides? CCK, GRP, glucagon, somatostatin, all these levels are increasing, and this would actually inhibit the food intake, isn't it? The lateral hypothalamus, which is the feeding center, is getting inhibited there. So what happened? The person reduces the food intake. And how is this proved? When CCK was injected into the hypothalamus, automatically the food intake of the person was getting reduced. So that is about the aminostatic theory. Now coming to the lipostatic theory. Lipostatic theory states that an increase in the level of the fatty acids and also the keto acids in the blood is activating the satiety center, okay, and it will inhibit the feeding center. So the presence of fatty acids and the keto acids would activate the satiety center and inhibit the feeding center. So what happens here is leptin, a hormone which is produced by the fat cells, and this leptin produced by the fat cells is proportionate to the fat content. So how much of fat content is there now in the blood, that much amount of leptin would be there. And this leptin, what will it do? It will act on the hypothalamus. It acts on the hypothalamus where it will start inhibiting the feeding center. And whenever the hypothalamus has got a leptin resistance, it results in obesity. So this is what you're going to remember about the lipotastic theory, where you need to remember that leptin is being released proportion to the fat content, and it will act on the hypothalamus, inhibiting the feeding center, and a resistance to leptin will result in obesity. Now coming to thermostatic theory. Thermostatic theory, the word itself tell you it's got something to do with the temperature. So thermostatic set point is there, which is regulating the appetite and feeding. This you would have come across. Appetite is increased when the temperature falls below a set point. In cold weather, the tendency for you to eat more. So that is increased appetite in cold climate. The SDA and the metabolic activity will actually increase the heat production. So that is about all the theories which are determining the feeding center and the satiety center. Now let's see what is the influence of hypothalamus on sleep. Now, when hypothalamus or different parts of hypothalamus is stimulated at very low frequency. So, we're just talking about an experimental condition where with low frequency, different parts of the hypothalamus is stimulated. Now, when the posterior hypothalamic region receives inputs from preoptic and the suprachiasmatic region, it will produce sleep. That means there is the existence of something called as the sleep center. I repeat it once again. So, the different parts of the hypothalamus is being stimulated with low frequency waves. So, when the posterior hypothalamic region, it receives inputs from preoptic and the suprachiasmatic region. So, when the posterior hypothalamic region receiving inputs from the preoptic and the suprachiasmatic region, what happens? The animal sleeps, which shows that there is something called as the sleep centers existing. Now, when there is stimulation of the intralaminar and the anterior thalamic nuclei happening, that is also inducing sleep. It's called as the diencephalic sleep zone. Whenever there is a lesion of the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, the person is not able to sleep. How do you call it? There is prolonged wakefulness. So, this all tells, both the slides where experimentally it was proved that yes, hypothalamus is the center for sleep, because stimulation of certain sleep areas in the hypothalamus made the person or the animal to sleep. When certain areas there was a lesion, the particular animal was not able to sleep at all. There was prolonged wakefulness. All this proved the involvement of hypothalamus in sleep. Now, what is the involvement of hypothalamus to stress? Now, whenever stress, the person or the animal is in any kind of stress, there is the release of corticotropin releasing hormone. Now, this corticotropin releasing hormone, there is the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, and this released levels of or increased levels of this adrenocorticotropic hormone increases the glucocorticoid secretion, and this increased levels of glucocorticoid secretion is actually the body's response to stress. So that is how we know that hypothalamus is involved in the maintenance or the management of stress, or this is a relation of stress to hypothalamus. Now let's see what is the involvement of hypothalamus in circadian rhythm. In Latin, the word circa means about and dia means day. So, circadian rhythm, if you see, hypothalamus along with limbic system takes care of the circadian rhythms. Now, this circadian rhythm, it can be mental, it can be physical, or it could be any behavioral change of yours which you see is following a daily cycle, and they respond primarily, the circadian rhythm, if you see, the primary response is to light and darkness around an organism's environment, and the circadian rhythm, if you see, is present in most of the cells of your body. We just talk only in terms of an individual or an animal, but this is a very interesting part, that is, the circadian rhythm is present in almost every cell in your body. Now, liver, if you see, example is liver is influenced by your food intake pattern. So, regularly you take food at a particular time, the liver gets influenced by it. So, before that time comes, the influencing or the inputs taken from the light and the darkness around an organism's environment, liver increases or decreases its secretions, which is going to aid in direct digestion. Other cells, the rhythm gets synchronized with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is located on either side of the optic chiasma. That means visual input. Optic chiasma is involved with the optic tract, the visual pathway, isn't it? So, this is how all the other cells are also receiving inputs about the day and the night cycle in an animal. Now, the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, it will receive information about the light and dark circle in the environment through which fibers, reticulo hypothalamic fibers. Now, this retino-hypothalamic fibers, can you see this word? This is actually very important. That is, the suprachiasmatic nuclei is receiving information about whether it's day outside or night outside. You know, it is through the retino-hypothalamic fibers that the suprachiasmatic nucleus is receiving input from. Now, what will happen then? There are efferents. So, the suprachiasmatic nucleus has already received the information via the retino-hypothalamic fibers, isn't it? So, this SCN now, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, the efferents go from there, which is going to initiate the fibers which are going from the SCN to different places, is going to initiate both synchronization between the neural and the hormonal component, which is going to determine many of your circadian rhythms. That means there is a circadian rhythm in the secretion of different, things like, the pituitary hormones, the adrenocorticotropic hormones, melatonin. Melatonin basically, if you know, it is secreted by the pineal gland when day ends and the night is starting by 6:30, 6:45, the melatonin secretion is being started by the pineal gland. So, all that, this limb you all should remember, where the connections, just want to highlight this point there. Can you see it here? The efferent connections, how the SCN is receiving, and now it is trying to influence all these. And this efferent connections from the SCN, which is initiating both the neural and the hormonal changes, where the sleep wake cycle of an individual or that activity pattern is also being regulated by this. So, that is with the next function of hypothalamus. Now, let's go to what is the involvement of hypothalamus in a person's emotional behavior. So, when it comes to emotion, I want you all to always remember the word the limbic system or the limbic cortex. So, hypothalamus along with limbic cortex controls a person's emotional reactions. So, what happens is, whenever the lateral hypothalamus is stimulated, whenever lateral hypothalamus is stimulated, what happens in the experimental animal? There was reactions of intense anger. The animal, when lateral hypothalamus is stimulated, showed intense anger. There is increased thirst, increased appetite. Look at when there is stimulation of the ventromedial nucleus of the thalamus, satiety is there, and placidity. All this shows that the lateral hypothalamus along with limbic system is controlling anger. It is a center for thirst, it is a center for appetite. When the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus was stimulated, satiety center, that is where the satiety center is present, isn't it? So the feeling of satiety, placidity, all that was shown by the experimental animal. Now you come to the word, the sham rage. Now, what is this sham rage? Sham rage, this picture you all should be able to recollect, this experimental animal. I need to go back to the previous slide now here. Now, whenever a transection of the brain below the thalamus is done above the hypothalamus, please remember this, transection of the brain below thalamus, above hypo. So, brain is transected below the thalamus, above the hypothalamus. When the brain, there is a transection, then you result in this condition of sham rage. And what are you trying to do? You are cutting off the cortical connections. So, when you are cutting off below the thalamus, above the hypothalamus, the cortical connections are cut off. What happens to the animal? That was what this picture I showed you. This is a sham rage response. So, when the cortical connections are cut off below the thalamus, above the hypothalamus, and that is when you get the sham rage response, isn't it? So, that when this experimental setup is made, that is cortical connections cut off below the thalamus, above the hypothalamus, and when you stimulate the animal. So, you need to talk about when there is a mild stimulation given to the animal. Any little thing, in dogs if you see, they start barking, they growl, they snap. That means, snapping is, they become very aggressive, they bare teeth. Now, in cats, with this experimental, this cortical connections are cut off below the thalamus, above the hypothalamus. In cats, even a mild stimulus, you see that, the cat lashes its tail. There is erection of hair, the protrusion of claws, tachycardia is there, rise in blood pressure, pupillary dilation. There is a combination of both anger and fear together, and physical manifestations, all these are the physical manifestations of rage or anger, isn't it? Now, it is combined with, unpleasant mental and emotional response to irritation. So, and if there is a removal of the inhibitory influence of the limbic cortex on the hypothalamus, so all these features, see in cat, you can see in this picture, the lashing of the tail to protrusion of the nails are protruded, the hair erection, all that, pupillary dilation, all these are actually the responses when mild stimulus is giving such a huge response, or the sham rage response in the cat. And dogs also we have specifically, so any mild stimulation is enough to cause all these changes in the particular animal. So, all this, and to create all this, the cortical connections are cut below the thalamus and the above the hypothalamus. So, now this, if you look at the last few slides, what I have done is I have just, tabular column has been shown where these are all some of the very important connections of hypothalamus, very important functional connections of hypothalamus. For example, Pepper's circuit. Pepper's circuit, what Pepper's circuit is, we have actually done with limbic system. So, Pepper's circuit is where the mammillary bodies are connected to anterior nucleus of the thalamus, the cingulate gyrus to hippocampus. From retina, fibers going to optic chiasma, hypothalamus, pineal body, melatonin secretion. So, what all this means is, these are all, some of the very important connections where hypothalamus is involved, which is functionally very important. So, that is what, the sixth point, that is whatever we have discussed till now in words, the functions of hypothalamus in a connection wise chart has been presented. So, that it is more the presentability, or it is more impressive if you try to put it in this paper, where the different centers have been connected by, where you can see when it comes to the melatonin secretion, we are making a reference of the circadian rhythm, the Pepper's circuit, how the emotions are being controlled along with limbic system. where hypothalamus, water reabsorption, what is the role of hypothalamus in maintaining water balance. You can see the fifth one, the sympathetic nervous system, how the autonomic nervous system is controlled. So all that is where, you know, the hypothalamus is functionally connected to other structures. And the last two I have put summary slides where you can see that it is the summary of the principal hypothalamic regulatory mechanism. So on the left hand side you can see all the functions, like for example temperature regulation, neuroendocrine regulation, appetitive behavior, all, you know, appetitive behavior where you are talking about thirst, hunger, all the sexual behavior, defense reactions of rage, control of body rhythm. So all the functions you can see on the left hand side. And to carry out this function, where should the efferent inputs, see, all these are functions carried out by hypothalamus, isn't it? Now for hypothalamus to carry this function, it needs to get inputs from all these areas. From here it should come. From here, these areas, what has been listed down, see, all this we have discussed in the previous slide. This is just a summarizing one where, you know, if you can recollect, the consolidation of your memory is going to be enhanced. So from all these areas, the efferent connections are going to reach the hypothalamus, and it is only then hypothalamus will be able to do all these functions which is mentioned on the left hand side. Now you look at the right hand side, integrating areas. That means efferent connections needs to, see, this is the functions which hypothalamus is doing. Fibers needs to come from here. From here, hypothalamus will takes the input, and hypothalamus, so here you have the hypothalamus, it will take the inputs from here, and what hypothalamus does is, it will integrate in all these areas, receives functions from this center part of the tabular column. This is where it is receiving from, receiving. This is where it is integrating. So receiving, integrating, the outcome is this. Do you get me? This is how you are going to, so whatever we have discussed slide wise, I have just put it like in a tabular column, so that you can see it continues to the other one also. You look at the last one, control of body rhythms is a function of hypothalamus. From where is it receiving the input from? Retina. From the retina it is receiving input via the retinohypothalamic fibers, and it will receive input from the retina through the retinohypothalamic fibers, and it will integrate at the suprachiasmatic nuclei, SCN, and integrating at suprachiasmatic nuclei, it is able to control all the rhythms, the circadian rhythms of the body is being controlled. So that's how you're going to read it. So I think that's with the hypothalamus. What hypothalamus is, what are the connections of hypothalamus, efferent, what are the functions of hypothalamus, and also finally everything with sham rage response was also done. And finally, whatever the whole thing what we discussed in the class, I have put these two, the last one, slide number 34 and 35, we have put it like a summary slide where everything about the functions of hypothalamus, which is the most important for your exam point of view also, you all are going to repeatedly read it and revise it, make it thorough. Thank you.